Mississippi, 1854. The Yazoo River wound through the valley like a vein of tarnished silver, feeding cotton fields that stretched so far they seemed to merge with the sky. On its eastern bank stood the Whitmore Plantation, a Greek revival mansion ringed by magnolias and debts. Colonel Charles Whitmore was 41, proud and desperate. His cotton yields were thinning, his gambling habits deepening, and his peers in Vicksburg society had begun to whisper that the Whitmore name, once synonymous with prestige, now meant collateral. Whitmore was not cruel in the loud way of some planters. His cruelty was polished, almost polite, the kind that came wrapped in wit and champagne. He liked to play philosopher, quoting Cicero while auctioning men, speaking of civilizing influence, as if ownership were education. What he wanted more than money was respect, the kind that couldn't be bought once lost. That summer, the Delta was a theater of wagers. Railroads were coming, fortunes were shifting, and planters entertained themselves by betting on everything: horse races, cotton prices, even human endurance. One humid evening, in the drawing room of the Vicksburg Gentlemen's Club, Whitmore and 3 others, Judge Eli Thorne, Major Abner Caldwell, and Dr. Samuel Riggs, sat beneath a haze of cigar smoke, arguing about class and breeding. Thorne claimed birth made the gentleman. Riggs insisted it was blood. Whitmore laughed and said, "Gentility is conduct, not complexion." Caldwell sneered. "You talk like one of them northern pamphleteers," he said. Whitmore sipped brandy. "No, I talk like a man who's seen refinement learned, not inherited." Riggs raised a brow. "Prove it, Charles. Take one of your own field hands, better yet, one of the kitchen women, and turn her into a lady. Let's see how long society bows before your experiment." The others roared with drunken amusement, but Whitmore's pride caught fire. "You think manners are shackles of birth?" he asked. "Very well. I'll show you that grace can be forged like iron." Thorne leaned forward. "Name your wager." Whitmore smiled. $5,000 and the satisfaction of humbling ignorance. I will select one of my servants, educate her in speech, letters, and etiquette. In 6 months, she'll attend supper among you, and you'll not know her origin." "Impossible," Caldwell said. "And dangerous." "You'll make a mockery of your own house. Then let it be a mockery that pays." The bet was sealed in ink before midnight. The club steward served another round, and laughter rolled out into the humid street, carrying a secret that would outlive them all. When Whitmore returned home that night, his wife, Eleanor, was waiting in the parlor, half asleep in her chair. She'd heard enough about her husband's wages to recognize the glaze in his eyes. "What foolishness this time?" she asked. "An experiment," he said, removing his gloves. "A harmless test of refinement." "Harmless," she echoed. "Like the horses you raced into the river." He ignored her. "There's a woman in the kitchen, Clara. Quiet, precise. She writes her own shopping lists. I've seen her read labels when others can't tell letters from marks. She'll do." Eleanor set her book aside. "Do for what?" He grinned. "To remind these braggarts that civility can be taught. I intend to make her a lady." Eleanor stared at him, realizing too late that he was serious. "And when the experiment's over?" "When it's over, I'll have won my wager, and perhaps restored some respect to this household." She rose. "You'll bring ruin, Charles. You always do." He poured another drink. "Ruin needs witnesses, my dear. These men will see triumph." Clara Danvers was 26 and had worked in the Whitmore kitchen since girlhood. Her mother, once a housemaid, had taught her to measure spices by scent and count coin by feel. Clara's literacy was an accident of proximity. She'd learned letters from discarded newspapers used to line shelves. Reading was forbidden, but curiosity disobeyed quietly. She spoke seldom, cooked perfectly, and watched everything. When the master summoned her to the study the next morning, she expected reprimand. Instead, Whitmore explained his proposal. "You are to learn comportment," he said. "Speech, scripture, conversation. You'll dine upstairs, wear what I provide, and address me as sir before others. It's an arrangement of education, not indulgence. Do you understand?" Clara nodded, though she did not. The conditions were too strange to refuse, and too dangerous to question. He dismissed her with a curt bow, as if already rehearsing civility. Within days, the household buzzed with rumor. Overseers whispered that the colonel had lost a wager involving his cook. The field hands exchanged looks of wary pride and fear. Eleanor moved through the house like a shadow, silent but alert. She ordered new gowns from New Orleans, not for herself, but for Clara. When they arrived, fine muslin and silk, the seamstress nearly fainted. At supper, Whitmore tested Clara's poise. He made her sit at the end of the table, correcting posture and diction, while servants pretended not to stare. "Say parasol," he instructed, "not umbrella. Speak from the diaphragm, not the throat." Clara repeated each word carefully, her voice low but clear. Inside, she felt an ache of dissonance, learning from a man who owned her, shaping sounds that could never buy freedom. Yet some part of her absorbed every lesson, storing them like seeds. Eleanor watched from across the table. "You make her into something you can't define," she said when the meal ended. "And when she surpasses you, what then?" Whitmore's smile was thin. "Then the experiment proves itself." That night, Clara returned to her quarters wearing the silk gown he'd chosen. The others stared. Some whispered admiration, others whispered fear. A child asked if she was free now. "No," she said softly. "I'm borrowed." By autumn, word of the Whitmore wager reached Vicksburg newspapers through servants' gossip. Editors printed it under society curiosities. A planter of high breeding instructs his cook in the graces of a lady, perhaps proving the unity of all mankind, or perhaps his own lunacy. The story delighted some and disgusted others. In drawing rooms, ladies laughed over tea, asking whether Whitmore would seat his pupil beside them at church. Gentlemen wagered counterbets on how long before the project collapsed. The pressure only fed Whitmore's obsession. He hired a tutor from Jackson, a displaced schoolmaster named Mr. Penn, to teach reading, arithmetic, and deportment. Penn, an abolitionist in hiding, recognized the irony. He taught diligently but warned Clara in private. "Knowledge cuts both ways. Use it carefully." She listened. By November, she could quote scripture and write her name in a neat, slanted hand. The colonel displayed her progress like a trophy, inviting guests to witness her recitations. "See," he'd say, "Grace obeys instruction." But something shifted during those demonstrations. The audience stopped laughing. Clara's poise unsettled them. She looked too composed, too aware. Rumor turned sharper. He's fallen under her spell. He intends to free her. He means to humiliate his wife entirely. Eleanor heard every whisper. The humiliation burned like fever. But beneath it grew curiosity. One evening, she visited the kitchen under pretense of needing tea. Clara was alone, reading from a tattered psalter. "You read beautifully," Eleanor said. "Thank you, ma'am." "How long before he shows you off to the town?" "I wouldn't know, ma'am." Eleanor studied her. "Do you enjoy it? This schooling?" Clara hesitated. "I enjoy understanding, ma'am, even if understanding hurts." The honesty startled Eleanor. She nodded once and left, but the words followed her for days. Winter came early. On Christmas Eve, the Vicksburg Club hosted its annual masquerade ball. Whitmore arrived in a tailcoat finer than he could afford, escorting a woman veiled in lace. When the music paused and he announced her name, Mrs. Whitmore, laughter erupted, then died as the veil dropped. Standing beside him was Clara, gloved, poised, radiant in ivory silk. For one suspended moment, no one breathed. Then the judge's wife fainted. Vicksburg woke to gossip thick as fog. By dawn, the story had raced along the riverboats. Colonel Whitmore had married his cook in public. The detail was wrong, of course. The ceremony had been no more than a boast wrapped in brandy. But that distinction evaporated in retelling. By breakfast, the merchants of Yazoo City were saying a magistrate had been bribed. And by evening, pulpits thundered that the end of civilization had begun in the Whitmore ballroom. At the plantation, silence hung heavier than frost. The household staff moved like ghosts, waiting to see who would fall first. Eleanor Whitmore remained upstairs, the door to her chamber locked since dawn. In the study, Charles sat amid unopened letters, half from creditors, half from clergymen demanding an explanation. He stared at the fire until the flames blurred. For the first time, he saw how quickly respect could rot. Clara, meanwhile, had returned to the kitchen and resumed her duties as if nothing had changed. Her gown hung folded across a chair. Her apron was back on. The others avoided her eyes, unsure whether she was victim or accomplice. Only the old housekeeper, Aunt Millie, dared speak. "Child, you can't stay," she whispered. "They'll use you to wash their guilt clean." Clara shook her head. "Running won't change what they've already named me. Let the truth sit where it was born." By New Year's Day, the scandal had reached the county courthouse. Judge Thorne, the same man who'd witnessed the wager, summoned Whitmore privately. The exchange lasted an hour. Witnesses later recalled the sound of raised voices behind the oak doors, and Whitmore emerging pale, hat in hand. That night he ordered his carriage and drove to Jackson to petition the governor for a statement of misrepresentation. The governor, alarmed at the uproar, advised him to leave Mississippi for a season until the weather of opinion cools. He left before dawn, leaving Eleanor to face the stairs alone. She began wearing black, though no one had died, telling callers her husband was indisposed by ridicule. Behind her shutters, she wrote letters she never mailed, one to her sister in Savannah, another to a New York newspaper that promised anonymity. Each draft began the same way. He did it for a bet. He never meant the words, but they believed him. When spring returned, a traveling preacher came through the county. He called himself Reverend Hale and claimed to bring revival. In truth, he was a reformist pamphleteer collecting stories of moral decay among the planter class. Someone directed him to the Whitmore plantation, saying, "You want a sermon about sin? That house will preach itself." Hale arrived uninvited one afternoon. Clara met him at the door, flower on her hands. "The family's not receiving," she said. "I'm not calling on the family," he answered. "I'm calling on history." He introduced himself and asked if she'd speak privately. They sat beneath the magnolia, where field hands once gathered for Sunday prayers. Hale took notes in a small ledger. Clara told him about the wager, the lessons, the night of the masquerade. She spared judgment. "He wanted to prove people could be shaped like clay," she said. "He forgot clay remembers the potter's hands." Hale published her account that summer under the title The Whitmore Experiment. Northern readers devoured it. Southern editors condemned it as abolitionist poison. Copies circulated secretly from plantation to plantation. Even those who denied its truth repeated its details, and in repeating them made them permanent. Eleanor read the pamphlet by candlelight. When she reached the final page, Clara's remark about Clay, she laughed, then cried. The next morning she walked to the kitchen, placed the booklet on the table and said, "They've made us characters in their morality play." Clara met her gaze. "Then let's decide what part we play." From that unlikely moment grew an uneasy alliance. Eleanor, shunned by her peers, began teaching Clara the ledger books, how to balance accounts, how to read interest rates, how debt truly ruled the South. "If he returns," she said, "he'll find the house still standing because of the woman he tried to ruin." Clara learned quickly. By midsummer she could recite figures from memory. The plantation turned profit for the first time in 2 years. But prosperity could not erase rumor. When Whitmore returned in August, leaner and meaner from exile, he found whispers thicker than vines. Men who once toasted him now smirked. Women refused to visit. In a rage he burned Hale's pamphlet and forbade Clara from entering the house. "You'll not mock me another day," he shouted. Eleanor stepped between them. "She saved what you squandered," she said. "She's more Whitmore than you." That line ended the marriage in all but name. The colonel moved into town, leaving his wife and the plantation in what he called temporary female supervision. For the next 2 years, the property flourished quietly under Eleanor and Clara's partnership. They introduced crop rotation, hired freed artisans for wages, and replaced overseers with foremen chosen by skill. Locals called it the 2-woman experiment. Some mocked, others admired. The fields did not care who signed the orders. Then, in 1857, fire consumed the carriage house. Town gossip claimed arson. Investigators found no culprit, but among the ashes they discovered a half-burned document, Whitmore's original wager contract, signed by the 4 men from the club. The inked terms were still legible. The news reignited the scandal. The Vicksburg Sentinel printed an editorial, "A gentleman who reduces matrimony to sport dishonors both law and gospel." Whitmore sued for libel, lost, and retreated north again. By the time the Civil War began, he was a relic whispered about with pity. Eleanor and Clara remained. When emancipation came, they reorganized the estate into a cooperative. Some said the 2 women signed a private covenant. Neither would claim ownership, both would claim stewardship. Formerly enslaved families built cabins on the hill and worked for wages. The place that had been born in arrogance became, improbably, a refuge. Years later, when Union soldiers marched through, they found a ledger in the dining room. On the first page, written in Clara's hand, were 3 lines. Debt paid. Lessons learned. Respect not borrowed. The officer who read it under the lamp muttered, "That's scripture enough for me," and left the book where he found it. By the time Reconstruction ended, most of the old planters were gone, their fortunes washed away with cotton prices. The Whitmore estate endured, its reputation transformed into legend. Some said Clara had vanished after the war, traveling north to open a school. Others swore she still walked the grounds at dusk, humming hymns the freedmen taught her. Eleanor died in 1882, her obituary calling her a benefactress of the county. No mention of the scandal appeared, only the line, "She believed character could not be owned." Decades later, descendants found the surviving ledger and the pamphlet, The Whitmore Experiment, bound together in the attic. Between their pages lay a pressed magnolia petal, brittle but intact. By the first decade of the new century, the Whitmore estate was no longer a plantation, but a patchwork of tenant farms and wild magnolia groves. The main house stood half empty, its columns streaked with mildew and its roof patched with tin. To travelers on the Yazoo Road, it looked like any other ruin of the Old South, but to local children, it was a ghost story. They called it the house that bet on a woman. In 1904, a young historian named Calvin Leary arrived from Atlanta. He had been hired by a university to collect oral survivals of antebellum society. When he reached Vicksburg and mentioned Whitmore, the hotel clerk's smile vanished. "That name's still a bruise," he said. "Best speak it soft." Leary nodded and took notes. He began with courthouse archives. The wager contract, singed at the edges, still rested in a sealed folder labeled Domestic Disturbance, 1857. The clerk allowed him a glance. The signatures were black ghosts on yellow paper. Beneath them, someone, perhaps a clerk of Reconstruction years, had penciled one sentence. Outcome: unfit for record. Lesson sufficient. From there, Leary visited farms around the old estate. He met men who had been children when freedom came, and women whose grandmothers remembered Clara. Their recollections wove a pattern that startled him. To black families, she was Miss Clara the cook who taught the book. To poor whites, she was the woman who ran Whitmore's money better than he did. To a handful of aged planters, she was proof the world went upside down. Leary realized each version said more about the teller than about her. One afternoon, he found himself in the parlor of Sarah Cole, 92 years old and still sharp. She claimed to be the daughter of one of Clara's apprentices from the cooperative years. They said Miss Eleanor and Miss Clara ran this place like two wings on the same bird, she told him. One knew numbers, one knew people. When one got tired, the other sang. Leary asked if the story about marriage was true. Sarah chuckled, showing a mouth of gold teeth. Lord, no. He married his shame, not her. Paper never saw a preacher, but that didn't stop folks from preaching on it. She led him to a cedar chest and lifted out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside lay the old household ledger and Hale's pamphlet. Between them, exactly as rumor promised, was a pressed magnolia petal. "You keep these safe," she said. "They've done their share of traveling." Leary spent weeks transcribing the documents. In his notes he wrote, "What began as ridicule became a blueprint. The experiment designed to prove hierarchy instead proved possibility. Yet when he submitted his article to a national journal, editors softened the edges. They titled it A Curious Episode of Mississippi Domestic Life, and cut every paragraph that questioned race or gender. Too controversial, they explained. Our readers prefer nostalgia to anatomy. Still, the story refused to stay buried. Copies circulated among teachers, suffragists, and black journalists. By the 1920s, the Whitmore scandal was being reimagined on lecture circuits as an allegory of Southern hypocrisy. Some portrayed Eleanor as heroine, others Clara, and a few made them both martyrs. Each retelling adjusted the moral lens. Progressives praised their partnership. Moralists condemned Whitmore's arrogance. Romanticists invented tenderness where there had been none. History turned elastic in their hands. In 1932, the Works Progress Administration's folklore project sent another interviewer, Dorothy Mayfield, to record surviving voices. Her transcript captured a balance Leary's article lacked. "What I found," she wrote, "wasn't tragedy or triumph, but an unfinished conversation between pride and conscience." She interviewed an old man named Jesse Green, who as a boy had worked in the fields. Miss Clara always said learning was like fire, he told her. Once it start burning, can't nobody own the flame. Dorothy's recordings, hissing cylinders of brittle wax, became the earliest known audio of those memories. In one fragment, a woman's voice hums a hymn beneath her words. Scholars later identified it as the melody to Come Ye Disconsolate. The singer explains that every year on Christmas Eve, women from the valley placed candles in their windows for the bet that broke the chains. No one remembered who started the ritual, but by the Depression, it was part of local tradition. When World War II came, the estate finally collapsed into weeds. Soldiers trained near the river and used the empty house for drills. One lieutenant wrote home describing, "A ruin where magnolias grow through the floorboards, and the locals swear a lady in white sits by the hearth, reading ledgers." His letter ended, "If ghosts exist, they balance accounts better than we do." By 1954, exactly a century after the wager, a historian from Jackson State named Marion Ellis rediscovered Leary's suppressed drafts. She was one of the first black women historians to receive national funding. And she recognized in the Whitmore affair a story larger than scandal. In her book Experiments in Respect, she reframed it as the turning point when the myth of innate superiority cracked under its own absurdity. When Whitmore tried to teach refinement to the enslaved, she wrote, he accidentally revealed that refinement had already been there. The publication reignited debate across the South. Some towns banned the book from libraries. Others held readings in church basements. A Vicksburg pastor declared, "We are still living the wager every time we decide who deserves dignity." By then, the Plantation site was little more than foundations under kudzu, but reporters trekked there anyway. They filmed the ruins and interviewed locals. One elderly farmer summed it up best. That house started with pride and ended with partnership. If that ain't progress, tell me what is. Half a century later, long after Ellis's death, a graduate student digitizing her archives noticed a marginal note beside the last chapter. Check attic for more ledgers. Intrigued, the student contacted the current owners of the land, descendants of sharecroppers who had bought it in the 1970s. During renovations, they had indeed found a trunk sealed behind plaster. Inside were personal letters from Eleanor and Clara, written during the final years before the war. The letters transformed myth into intimacy. One line from Eleanor to Clara read, "He wagered to prove a difference. We proved survival instead." Another from Clara replied, "If the world remembers only the bet, remind them who kept the books." Those sentences became the epigraph of the museum exhibit that opened in 2010 in Vicksburg's Cultural Center. The Whitmore Experiment, a scandal that changed the South. Visitors walked through rooms filled with copies of documents, portraits, and that single magnolia petal preserved under glass. The final plaque read, "The bet lasted 6 months. The lesson, a century." That was the legacy. A boast that had outlived its maker. A partnership that history tried to silence. And a myth that kept reinventing itself until it resembled truth. Standing before the display, school children asked guides whether the story was real. The guides always answered, "Real enough to remember." 2 centuries after the wager that began in pride, the Whitmore story survives mostly in paper and air. The mansion itself is gone. The Yazoo bends through marsh and silence. But in the Vicksburg Cultural Center, one gallery still glows with soft amber light. At its center sits a single display. The ledger, the pamphlet, the Whitmore experiment, and the magnolia petal pale as memory. Visitors approach quietly. School groups read the panels, while docents guide them through the contradictions of the age. The text beside the case reads, "A gentleman placed a bet to prove refinement could be taught. The lesson he learned instead was that refinement already lived among those he enslaved." College students film the exhibit on their phones. Elderly tourists linger longest, staring at the handwriting, curling, exact, neither elegant nor crude, just human. In a corner, a video screen plays excerpts from historians who rebuilt the narrative from fragments. Leary's suppressed notes, Dorothy Mayfield's recordings, and Marion Ellis's book. One scholar's voice sums up the mystery. What began as humiliation became a test case for conscience. The South could ignore the war's outcome, but it could never again pretend ignorance was virtue. Every year on Christmas Eve, volunteers place a candle in the window of the museum, and another on the hill where the plantation once stood. They call it the Night of the Bet. Some light the candles for Eleanor, some for Clara, some simply for the idea that dignity can survive its enemies. The candles flicker against the dark river, and people passing on Highway 61 slow their cars, wondering why the hill is lit. Outside, the curator, a descendant of tenant farmers, locks the door and watches the glow fade through the glass. She keeps a note in her pocket, copied from the old letters. He wagered to prove a difference. We proved survival instead. She says the words aloud each December as benediction. What do you think about the Whitmore wager? Was Charles Whitmore a man trapped by pride, or the product of a system that mistook cruelty for culture? Was Clara's quiet endurance a victory, or just a mirror held up to power? Can understanding the past ever balance the ledger of what it cost? Leave your thoughts below. If you value stories that challenge simple judgments, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another forgotten chapter. Share this video with someone who believes that history should be told honestly, even when honesty hurts. At History in Chains, we preserve the stories that refuse to stay buried, stories that reveal how arrogance, courage, and conscience shaped the same world. Remember, every chain has two ends, and the past still tugs at ours. See you in the next episode.